This video shows you how to stitch Saffy and can be used as a guide for the other Simply Small characters. First, gather your materials following the list on the instructions. You'll need felt, thread, a needle, pins, a scissor, and the pattern. Step 1. Cut the pieces out. Follow the dotted lines to cut out each of the sections of the pattern according to color. Then, place these sections on a matching colored piece of felt. Pin the paper to the felt. For the bigger pieces, you can place the pins inside the shape. For the smaller pieces, it's easier to put the pins outside the shape and use your finger to pinch down and hold the paper in place as you cut. Continue cutting all the shapes on the pattern and you'll end up with what you see here. Keep the cutout of the paper pattern as you'll be able to use this as a guide following the shaded areas to place the detail pieces when you stitch them on in the next step. Step 2. Sew on the details. Begin stitching by threading your needle with white embroidery floss and tying a knot at the end. Hold the eye in place and insert the needle from the back to the front and pull it through so that the knot will end up hidden on the inside. Then insert your needle from the front to the back to complete your first running stitch. Continue stitching all the way around with nice even running stitches back and forth until you reach the end. On your last stitch, pull it through to the back. Then cut off the thread with enough room so that you can break it apart and tie a double knot to seal off the thread. Then trim off the thread closer to the knot to keep things tidy. Now start the same process using dark brown thread for the pupil. Start your stitch from the back so that the knot ends up on the inside. Then continue all the way around with nice even running stitches going back and forth through the felt. Once again, tie it off at the end to secure the thread and trim it to keep it tidy. Repeat this process for the spots that go on Saffy's back. Stitch on the spots the same as you did with the eye, except do not stitch any of the edges that run along the edge of the stuffie. Now you have a front and a back with details sewn on, plus a few separate pieces that will go in the middle. Step 3. Edges and stuffing. Thread your needle with a dark brown thread and a knot at the end. Place the two pieces, front and back, together so that they align. Now you'll begin blanket stitching around the edges. Start by inserting your needle from the middle so that the knot will be hidden inside. In this case, I need a moment to tuck in the stray threads from the knot. Put the thread back in through the same hole so that it will come out on the other side in alignment with the first hole. Before you finish, loop your needle through the loop of thread so that you can complete this first stitch. Now you begin the next stitch over, following the same process of threading your needle through the loop before you finish the stitch. Now you've completed your first blanket stitch, which will look the same on both sides. Once again, move your needle over in a matching width to the other stitch and loop it through the thread before you finish the stitch. You'll also want to sew a blanket stitch around the earpiece before the earpiece gets sewn into place, as I'll show you in the next step. As you blanket stitch around the stuffie, you'll reach a point at which you'll need to add the ear and horns, at which point you'll place the earpiece and the horn pieces between the front and back body pieces and hold them in place with your finger. You'll switch to a whip stitch at this point, which simply runs back and forth through the 3 layers of felt in evenly spaced stitches. The tricky part with the whip stitch is getting it to align nicely from front to back. So pay attention where your needle enters the fabric on one side and where it exits the fabric on the other side, because the felt is so thick that it can make it challenging to match them without careful placement. Once you've done that section with a whip stitch, return to the blanket stitch. Proceed with the blanket stitch until you reach the tail. There, you'll do the same process as you did with the ear and horns, inserting the tail between the front and back sections and using a whip stitch. Return to the blanket stitch after the tail section. Continue on with the blanket stitch around the legs. When you reach a corner, place the stitch at a 45-degree angle. Stitch it like you would any other blanket stitch. The only difference will be that the thread will angle off on 45 degrees to reach the tip of the corner, like so. Then proceed with the next stitch in the new direction, just as you normally would, inserting from the back, through the felt, out the other side, and then looping it through the thread before you finish the stitch. And pulling it tight, and there you get a neat and tidy corner. Now you'll have the edges stitched all the way around, except for 2 openings. For Saffy, I've left 1 opening on the head and 1 opening on the body. But for some of the more rounded characters, you may only need 1 larger opening instead. Add the stuffing a little bit at a time. To reach tight corners, it might be helpful to use a pencil. This is especially important in the neck, where you want to pack it tightly so it's strong enough to hold up the head. When the body is fully stuffed, it's time to finish stitching the edges. Use a blanket stitch to close the holes, and when you reach where it began, then overlap your last few stitches so that it will seal off the thread nicely. And what I like to do is on the very last stitch I loop the thread back and forth through several times just to make sure it's not going anywhere. As the final step, I trim the thread the same way we did all our others, and I tie a double knot at the end. The only difference is this one will be on the outside, so I trim it very close to the knot so you hardly notice it at all. And now you have a finished stuffie. Look at that. That's it.